Now we're here outside the forum in Copenhagen because we're going to make an attempt to speak to Steven Chu, who's the American Secretary for Energy. Now he's a really important guy because he's responsible for America's response to climate change. He's also a real scientist. Now the Bush administration didn't do real science, didn't have any real scientists. Steven Chu's actually a Nobel Prize winner, so he knows a heck of a lot about climate change, and luckily he's responsible for actually dealing with it. So let's go and try and talk to him now. So Steven Chu is speaking at something called the Bright Green Expo, which is a whole bunch of exhibition stalls sponsored by the Confederation for Danish Industry. So very much the science, technology, business approach to solving climate change with technical solutions. It's kind of like a weird futuristic trade fair with spinning wind turbines and flashing lights and strange personal mobility scooters. I don't know why they can't just walk. They only go about half a mile an hour, but this is what this is all about, new technologies. I suppose this is how the techno-optimists think we're going to live in a low-carbon future. But looking around, it's actually difficult to see anything which fills you with hope and joy. Hopefully Steven Chu can enlighten us further with his perspective. The United States, of course, historically has always been the bad guy in the Kyoto negotiations. The Bush administration didn't ratify Kyoto, so rejected it completely out of hand. And at that time, of course, the Americans were the world's #1 emitter. Now that role has now been taken by China, but the US still has to come up with something at these talks. They've got to put an offer on the table which actually reduces their emissions over the long term and gets us back down to the safe climate zone where we so desperately need to be. What's on the table at the moment from the Americans is just a 3% cut below 1990 levels, so even worse than what was on the table back in Kyoto in 1997. So we've got to see by the end of this week whether the Americans are prepared to up their game.
If you look at the goal we are trying to achieve, to get down to, in the United States, to a decrease in our carbon emissions of 80%, in the world, to decrease our carbon emissions by 50%. Then, to get to there by mid-century, we also need new science, new technologies. And so for that reason, the Department of Energy, if we can develop a battery that can last 5,000 deep discharges, something on the order of the lifetime of the car, 15 years, and has 2 megajoules of energy storage, megajoules per kilogram. That corresponds to about 600 watt hours per kilogram. That will electrify the automobile industry. The good news is we're going to get halfway there, I think, within several years. And whether we can get all the way there, it depends on things. But we see on the horizon, the immediate horizon, something that's at least double the energy density. I want to remind you, you've heard a lot of science and technology, but I want to remind you of this famous picture called Earthrise. It was taken by the first mission of Apollo that went to the far side of the moon. It shows a very desolate moon, a very warm, inviting Earth. And one take-home message you should be, by staring at this picture is there's nowhere else to go. Now, since that time, we've discovered that humans have altered the destiny of the Earth, and we really have to act in order to mitigate the worst of the possibilities. And so I want to leave this quote with you from Martin Luther King. He spoke in 1967 about ending the Vietnam War, but these words actually ring more true about today's crisis. And he said, "We are now faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We're confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late." Thank you.
So we've just seen Steven Chu's PowerPoint presentation. He's talking about lithium-ion batteries, he's talking about pumped storage, he's talking about all the different genetically engineered plants which could potentially save the world with all of the new possibilities with biofuels. But of course, what he doesn't say is whether the US is prepared to take on a stronger target. And if all these whiz-bang technologies are really there as an option, why don't the Americans stand up and say, okay, we're prepared to go carbon neutral, we're prepared to take the same steps as they're doing in the Maldives?